Hey guys, today we're going to talk about attraction and intimacy. I'm going to go through these slides sort of briefly just to kind of give you some information about them. Of course, I always hope that you supplement with the book just because we can't go in as much detail, but I do hope that these lecture slides, these recorded lectures do help you with the content. So before we start, what I'd like for you to do, and this is kind of neat. Since this is recorded, what you can do is you can go ahead and you can pause it here. But what I'd like for you to do is to write a personals ad. So just jot this down. You're not going to turn it in, and you're not going to submit it or anything like that. This is just an advertisement that you would write. For example, if you were on a dating website, or if you were back in the day, you would actually submit these to newspapers or websites, and you would explain what you were looking for, who you were seeking, if you were male or female, if you were seeking another male or female, et cetera, et cetera. And what I'd like for you to do is just jot down just a few basic characteristics that you're looking for in a significant other. So this is someone that you desire to have a long-term relationship with, not like a fling, but someone that you're actually would like to spend, a significant amount of your time with. Do things like, write down their gender, their age, characteristics like, does this person have a job? Do they have a sense of humor, responsibility? Do they live in their parents' basement? Whatever. And so you're going to list about 5 of your most important attributes that you consider important, and you're going to put those in order. And then also put your gender. So set this aside, and then we're going to come back to it. Normally when I do a face-to-face class, this is a really fun activity, and what I usually do is have everyone swap these ads, and we take a poll of the whole class. But we're going to come back to this in just a minute. So just kind of take a moment to jot down what you would consider your 5 top attributes in a person that you would like to have a long-term relationship with. And this doesn't necessarily have to be someone that you actually currently are with, just ideally what you would like in a significant other. Okay, so when we talk about having intimate relationships, social relationships with other people, of course, we as humans have a basic need for intimacy. We, don't want to be ostracized. We want someone to care for us and love us and to be intimate. And that doesn't necessarily mean sexual intimacy. And it can mean that you confide in someone and that you are intimate with them, not necessarily in a sexual way. That if we don't, if we are in a relationship with somebody and we feel angry toward them, we can ostracize them, we can exclude them from activities, ignore them, ignore texts, ignore calls, give someone the silent treatment, don't talk to them. They may talk to you and you're quiet and you don't really give them attention. And if you think about this, this is very typical of relationships where our attention and affection is what we use to barter. When we feel angry or upset by someone, we tend to ostracize that person. And whether it's, an actual relationship where it's 2 people who are in an intimate relationship, or just your friend, somebody that you are close with and just consider a friend, we tend to use our affection and attention as punishment, or we retract that as punishment for bad behavior. This does have negative outcomes. Of course, if you ignore somebody enough, if you give them the silent treatment, of course they will become angry and upset with you. Obviously, the best way to resolve conflict is to talk it out in communication, but this is something that we all tend to do. But it does generally give negative outcomes if we're doing it all the time. So there's a few things here that have been studied and determined that actually leads to how friendships form and how attractions form. So we're going to go through each one of these sort of individually: proximity, physical attractiveness, similarity versus complementarity, and rewards. So the first one is proximity, and it's just simply how close you are to someone. So if you see this is a schematic of an apartment complex. And so you can see here that there are 10 rooms. So this is 10 apartments. And the idea of proximity and this idea of functional distance is how far are you from this other apartment, the people who are in this other person who's in another apartment. If you live in apartment 10, you're not going to necessarily bump into person in apartment 6 all that often. Okay. You are more likely, if you're in apartment 10, to bump into, someone in apartment 9 or apartment 5. Apartment 4 and 5, they have a really close proximity toward each other, and they're very likely to bump into each other much more often. 8 and 9 are spread apart by quite a few feet, and they don't share a common staircase. So, this idea of proximity is who are the people that you're going to run into most likely. If you live in a large apartment complex and there are several mailboxes that are sort of congregated together, you're going to be much more likely to run into those people that share the same space in terms of mailboxes than somebody who lives a half mile down the road in another building. And some of these apartment complexes are really spread out and really, large distances where you may never see somebody who lives across the way from you just because you're not in their line of traffic. And so the idea is that you're much more likely to interact with people who have a close proximity, and you're going to be much more likely to get to be friends with those people, and because you're seeing them all the time and you become acquaintances, and that sort of builds from that. So simple proximity explains a lot of the friendships and even attractions that we end up having. Physical attractiveness is a big thing, and there's a link here to a Parks and Recreation video. I find this very funny, and if you've watched the series, you probably know the characters. You probably find this funny as well. But whenever we look for people, we tend to have this idea that how attractive is that person? And a lot of times what we end up doing is we end up rating people. So we may say, oh, that's, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being really, really attractive and 1 not being attractive, that might be a 3 or a 4. And then you rate the person who they're with. And a lot of people tend to do this when they're out, people watching, they'll say, oh, that's a couple there, and that looks odd because that person is very attractive and the other person isn't. Why are they together? There must be something else there to explain that. And so this idea that when men and women tend to choose partners who are similar in attractiveness, so sort of similar rating, this is this idea of matching phenomenon. And so also we see this in other traits as well. So kindness, for example, of people who are very kind, they'll match with other people who are also very kind. And we see them matching on these sorts of traits. And we also have this schema, and we talked about schemas a lot in this class, this idea of, a grouping of schematics that we have for something. Beautiful is good is a schema. This idea that, and this is more of a Western sort of American schema, that if a person is attractive, then therefore they're good, they're kind, they're nice, they're overall, they have all these specific traits. And this is interesting because this could actually be a self-fulfilling prophecy, because there have been studies that have been conducted to show that it's very likely that even from birth, when we consider someone to be attractive, we actually treat them a lot differently, and that can promote different traits in those people. So for example, there have been studies that have been done, and this is going to sound kind of sad, but this is an interesting study, where they've looked at orphanages in other countries. And what they've found is that in cases where an infant is considered attractive, really cute, it's determined that nurses spend more time with those infants. They hold them more. They pay more attention to them. They smile at them more compared to the less attractive or more quote unquote normal looking infants. And so this already from birth, we find that attractiveness plays in the role of how much attention one gets, how many times a person is going to smile at you. And so if you are already sort of brought up at the very beginning with a better setup, and a higher expectation for you to be good and kind and have a lot of attention and, to be a overall good person, then that might just simply be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And so we've seen this in a lot of different studies. So here are some examples just from Disney, looking at the princesses. The princesses are always pretty, they're attractive, they're good, people, they're kind, they're generous, they're not conceited. Whereas, for example, here, Ursula and the evil stepmother and Cinderella and her stepsisters, they're ugly, they're not attractive, and they don't have those good traits that a beautiful person would have. And again, this is just sort of our culture, this is coming into drilling this into our heads ever since we're very, very little. So when we talk about attractiveness and what is considered attractive, what's really interesting is that, of course, it's culturally specific. But we do find some things that are across cultures, for example, symmetry of the face. So when we look at taking a bunch of people and putting them together, so this next slide here is an example. So the top four are real people. These are real faces. And these are essentially put into a program, and then they are averaged out. So the one on the bottom is considered a composite. This is not a natural face. This is something that is an average of a bunch of ordinary faces. And what's found is that when we do this over and over and over again, people actually prefer this unnatural composite face and consider that face much more attractive than ordinary faces. And what's really interesting is the website that I've listed on here, you can actually go on here and you can click through all of the demos and all the different faces and different types, men and women, they're different races, different face shapes, etc. And you can actually select a bunch of different ones and make composites of each of those. And you can determine yourself if you consider that face more attractive than the originals. So it's very interesting how we do that. And so this is what we refer to as the perfect average. Now, the symmetry, I'm going to skip to this next slide here. What's interesting here is that the more symmetrical a face, and this is across cultures, the more symmetrical a face, the more attractive that face is considered. Now, these are some interesting examples, but and some of you may disagree that these more symmetrical faces, they look odd just simply because we do see that, most faces obviously aren't perfectly symmetrical. When we look at this in studies, we find that even celebrities and other pictures of non-celebrities, when you take the face and you make a symmetrical copy of it, these aren't great examples, but when you have a perfectly symmetrical face, people tend to rate that face as much more attractive than the original face. Now, when we talk about evolution and attraction, of course, we find that beauty can signal certain things that are biologically important. So, for example, in evolution, remember, evolution is the idea that, in evolution, there is an idea that things that we do and things that we've done in the past must have been important enough to survive through generations and generations and generations of humans. In order for us to do those things today, they must have been important for our survival at some point. At some point. So when we look at things like health, youth, and fertility, if we look at someone, for example, a woman, and the woman looks healthy, she looks youthful, that sort of translates to that woman must be fertile. And so this is deemed attractive because the idea is that human nature is that we want to continue our DNA line, we want to continue and survive. And so, you're not going to, necessarily seek out an 80-year-old woman who doesn't look youthful or healthy, and obviously isn't fertile simply because she's already gone through menopause. That won't be as attractive as a 18-year-old girl who is very healthy, has a healthy glow, and is much more obviously likely to be fertile compared to a much older woman. And so this idea of youthfulness and attractiveness go hand in hand, and we have an evolutionary explanation for why a person may be attracted to that. Now, similarity versus complementing one another. Of course, and this is a big argument. Do opposites attract? Do people who tend to be like other people tend to flock together? So do birds of a feather flock together? What we find is that when you have a trait or a series of traits that you like in a certain person, you're going to be more likely to, and you have that in common, you're going to be much more likely to want to be be with that person, not necessarily an intimate relationship, but you want to necessarily be friends with them. Likeness begets liking. If you like somebody, you're going to want to spend more time with them, and you're going to want to like them more. When you have a similarity, a trait that you share, that likeness will translate to you liking them because you are going to feel more connected to them. Dissimilarity does tend to breed dislike. So if you are not similar to a person, maybe politically, if you're not similar to them in your goals in life, if you're not similar to them, let's say you have a young family, you have children, and then you have a friend that is very much a partier, and that person doesn't really value family like you do, they're not at that stage, that dissimilarity tends to breed dislike. And you kind of think about that more and more. And if you are very dissimilar from someone, that can sort of grow over time, and more dissimilar things you tend to think about, and you tend to dislike that person. Now, the idea of, do opposites attract? Do we tend to go into relationships with people who are complete opposites? And this has been argued a lot. So it turns out that through a lot of research, what we've found is that opposites tend to only attract when it comes to things like flings. So if you're coming off of a relationship, let's say, and you have a rebound, and you have somebody who is, that you don't find that you want to spend a long time with, a person that you don't want to necessarily get married to, you don't want to have a long-term relationship with, we tend to go with somebody who's very different from us. It's a change, it's exciting, it's something that is different, and we might find more passion there, and we tend to like that. However, in study after study, what we find is that when people complement each other, for example, when they have similar goals, when they have similar traits, when they have, they rate things similarly, and they're more similar as people, they actually tend to do better over time. And when we consider long-term relationships, we tend to look for people that share our values and share our traits, because over time, we are able to like them more, and we tend to stay with them longer. So because let's say that you have somebody who you're completely opposite with, and you're in a relationship with them, should you break up with them because it's not going to last? Of course not. We certainly have cases where people are relatively opposites, and they work it out just fine. But when people tend to complement each other, it doesn't necessarily mean they're exactly the same. It could be that, one person, I like to use this example. It's silly, but it's like you both love hamburgers, and one person hates pickles and the other person loves pickles. Well, when you go out and you get hamburgers, then you can give your pickles to the other person. You complement each other. If one person tends to be kind of hot-headed and the other one tends to be really calm, that's not necessarily opposites, but you can tend to complement each other. But we do find that people with more similar traits tend to do better in a long-term relationship. Okay, so this idea that attraction, this reward theory of attraction, is really, when it comes down to, if you've had learning, if you've gone through all of you have taken introductory to psychology, or introduction to psychology. So all of you have heard about this and read about this. But if you've taken more advanced classes in learning, what you find is that certain behaviors can be rewarding in a reinforcement type of way. And so what we find is that when we are with people who we like and whose behavior is rewarding, we like that behavior, we actually respond to that in the same sort of way as, sort of simply speaking, how B.F. Skinner would train a pigeon or a rat, this idea that it's reinforcing. So just like you would give a dog a biscuit for sitting, right? That's rewarding. In a very similar way, we are rewarded by attracting behavior, or attractive behavior. And so when we're with people who we really like, we tend to like them even more and want to spend even more time with them, because that's rewarding. And what's rewarding is that feeling of likeness, the feeling of belonging, getting their attention. That is something that's a rewarding event. And so we tend to really enjoy that. And so we seek that out, and those relationships become rewarding. And so that's why we continue to go back. Okay, so what I'd like for you to do is, earlier in the lecture, I asked you to write this personals ad. And what I'd like for you to do is to kind of pull it out. And I want you to see what your attributes were that you listed at the beginning. Now, I do want to kind of caution you. Now, this doesn't always work perfectly. It does tend to work really well with a large group, and we can kind of get averages. This isn't the case for every single person, but many dozens of studies have looked at the reasons and how and why men and women choose certain characteristics in the other sex. Now, if you are not heterosexual, there's not been, I would consider, enough research to look at this in homosexual couples or bisexual couples, or even multiple, not just two people. Or sort of open relationships. So this is going to be different for those. So we're just talking about heterosexual relationships here, and I want to really be specific about that. So if you are not heterosexual, you may find that these results don't necessarily, they may not be perfectly aligned with what you've written down. And of course, there are people doing research on this to see, does this match up with heterosexual couples? So what we tend to find in these studies is, when we ask a woman, what are the attributes that are most important to you in a man? What we find is that things like record of achievement, are they a leader? Are they skillful? Do they have a job? Do they make good money? Do they have a sense of humor? Are they smart? Are they attentive? Do they have common sense? Are they athletic? Do they have abstract reasoning? Now, notice that more toward the bottom, almost number 10, when we look at, actually, if you look on here, okay, I skipped it, you will actually see, because I was thinking attentiveness, you actually don't see attractiveness on here. The closest that we get, which is almost number 10, is athletic ability. You see things like, how able is this person? Do they have a job? Are they intelligent? Are they attentive? And so there's an evolutionary explanation for this. And so not everybody loves this explanation. And remember, this is just something to explain why it is that we find in case after case that women tend to list these attributes, and attractiveness tends to be very low on the list, if on the list at all. And that is, this evolutionary explanation is very, very raw. So I just want to kind of warn you here. Now, when you think about men and women and evolution, the idea is that we want to continue our species and we want to procreate. And so when you consider and this is not like a feminist rant, this is simply just biology, okay? When you consider what women and men, their contributions to conceiving a person, a human, right, conceiving a baby, when you consider the contributions, the bare minimum that's needed for men is sperm. And that's just that. This is just, think about this in a very, 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 very simple sort of raw way. Okay. Women have to get pregnant, right? They have to carry the baby to term. So carry the baby for 9 months. And then remember, looking at this at a completely simplistic view, the baby needs to eat. And so we'll kind of go back and think about, back in really early human days, a baby needs to have breast milk. And this is, before formula, right? And that baby needs to nurse. And so, typically, you're looking at least a couple of years. So combined with 9-month pregnancy plus nursing for a couple of years, that's a very big time commitment on a woman. And so men, the bare minimum is the sperm. And so the idea is that a woman is going to seek out a man who seems to be responsible and reliable, because that's most important to a woman. Because when a woman is pregnant and first has a baby, she really can't do anything. You can't pop out a baby and go run and chase down an antelope and eat it. You've got to have support. So this idea, this evolutionary explanation, can explain why we see, even this many, hundreds of thousands of years later, why women still seek out men who are responsible and who are able to take care of her in a way that, is sort of quote unquote old school, this idea that this is a very basic idea. We're not talking about women now who can hire help or get family or, works at a job. And, we're talking about early human days where we were hunter-gatherers. And so in the course of human species being hundreds of thousands of years old, this has been so important that this trend and the idea that women work and can have a baby and go back to work, this is a new phenomenon. This is not something that's hundreds, thousands of years old. So this idea has really ingrained in our species so much that women still tend to rate these things very high on their list of characteristics that seek out men. Now we flip this in men seeking women. So physical attractiveness tends to be really high up on the list of men seeking women. Ability in bed, warmth and affection, social skills, homemaking ability, dress sense, sensitivity, good taste, moral behavior, moral perception, artistic creativity. When we look at the flip side of this, okay, so all we need from men is sperm, so we need to find somebody who is going to be attentive, who is going to stick around, who's going to help, who's going to provide, right? When we look at men seeking women, if the purpose of the man is to procreate and find a woman to procreate with, right? This is an evolutionary explanation, right? Then we need to find a woman who looks fertile. And so we talked about attractiveness being a part of this, right? You need to be attractive to reflect this fertility. Youth tends to be high on a man's list, somebody that looks youthful. Ability in bed, being able to, they need to be attracted in order to be able to procreate. This warmth and affection, social skill, homemaking ability all applies to being able to have a household and to care for children and be sensitive, right? And so what we find, evolutionarily speaking, is that men tend to seek women who can provide this to enable them to be able to procreate. So again, I'm not saying, oh, this is everybody's reason, everybody should have a baby. No. This is just an explanation for why we see this in studies over and over and over again. And you may even see this in your own personal ZAD of what you've ranked being a man or a woman. Now, obviously, if you're transgendered or transsexual, or if you're not heterosexual, your results may differ. And of course, researchers are very interested in that, and they're doing studies on that. There's just been a lot more studies on heterosexual individuals simply because there are more of them. So this idea of what is love, passionate love, this is this exciting, intense love, this physical love. You want to be with that person. It's emotional. You just can't get enough of them, and it's a very sort of passionate feeling. Companionate love is something that is a lot more complex. It's something that we really, really love and we want to be with, and we're deeply entwined with that person, intertwined with that person. And we tend to see a lot of times in long-term relationships, we see a passionate love start out in the relationship, and that tends to develop into companionate love. And sometimes we see that passionate love does fade, but then there have been studies to show that that's not necessarily the case, that they can sort of go in hand in hand. This idea that, you also feel this passion for this person, but you also feel that person's your best friend and that person is your companion. And this companionate love doesn't necessarily have to be somebody that we're sexually involved with. This can be somebody that's, maybe your absolute best friend that you can't live without, and you really feel like a companion to them. But generally speaking, we tend to see that relationships start out with this passionate love, and that tends to develop into companionate love. And so we ask ourselves, okay, now how are we able to have close relationships? Obviously, attachment's a very big, important factor. When we look at this need to belong, our need to be social. This is an adaptive thing. This is something that's important for the human species. This is important for people. This is important for, developing relationships with our children, developing relationships with others. And if you've taken other psychology courses, for example, developmental psychology, you might have learned a bit about attachment styles. And so what we do is we look at, this has been studied in monkeys, this has been studied in kids, human children, and looking at how one is attached to their caregiver. And what we find is that now this isn't every single case, but we do see that if you have a poor attachment to your caregiver, sometimes this can translate to, as an adult, poor attachments to others. And it can be, picking bad relationships, picking, people who don't care for you in the same way that, in a healthy way. And so attachment styles can play a role, but it doesn't necessarily mean because you had a bad upbringing or a poor start that you're not going to find a very good close relationship with, whether it's a intimate relationship with somebody or friendship. We just find that there are patterns here. And of course, there are many different attachment styles. And I'm not going to get into that in this lecture because that's a whole lecture in of itself. But you can look at the book with a little bit more information about attachment styles. Equity is simply that, you want to get out of a relationship what you put in it. You want people to love and care for you. And you would expect, if you love and care for someone, to them to reciprocate that. And so equity in a relationship is very important. You hear people are the takers or people are the givers. You want some 50-50 in that. Self-disclosure is also very important. And this idea that you want to, relate intimate information about yourself to somebody else. If you have somebody who you trust, you want to be able to tell that person, your goals in life, your dreams, things that are scary, things that are emotional, things that you keep very guarded. And you want to be able to tell people those things. But there's also this idea of reciprocity. So, if you're going to have a conversation with your partner and you're going to be open and you're going to give information, you expect them to also disclose about themselves. So, if you have a relationship where someone isn't as open, that can affect this equity. And you feel maybe perhaps they're not putting into that relationship as much as you are. Now, when we talk about jealousy, now this is really interesting. And going back to what we talked about evolutionarily speaking, this explanation for why men and women seek the other sex, what's really interesting here is that infidelity, or sort of cheating on someone else, we find that men and women tend to view infidelity differently. Now, this isn't every single person, and I've had classes upon classes of people raising their hand and saying, well, this doesn't describe me, and that's okay. This is just what we find in the majority. What we find when we poll a bunch of people is that women tend to find emotional infidelity much more upsetting than passionate infidelity, and men tend to find passionate infidelity much more upsetting than emotional infidelity. So let me give you an example here. So a woman might be much more upset that her husband is in love with another woman. And she would be less upset if the man had sex with a woman. So she's more upset that he's in love with someone versus if he had just had sex with her. Men tend to be the opposite of that. So they get more upset if a woman, let's say their wife or significant other, has sex with another man instead of she says, I'm in love with this person. The idea is that they would be less upset. Not saying they wouldn't be upset, but this idea is that an evolutionarily, driven explanation is go back to this idea of, early humans. And there is no guarantee for paternity for men, right? There's no guarantee before paternity tests. There was no real way to know if a man's child is his child. Whereas maternity is guaranteed because you actually see the baby come out of the woman, so you know that baby belongs to the woman. So this idea that a man doesn't necessarily know if his child is his, that could explain why a man would be more upset at a woman having sex with the potential of getting pregnant and procreating without him, right? That's his job in pre-human, evolutionarily speaking, words. When we look at women, a woman would be much more upset if a man had an emotional tie and fell in love with another woman because that's her support system. And if he can have sex with other women, that's fine. And he can even have babies with other women as long as they doesn't support them. If he loves another woman, that woman has lost her, her financial support. She's lost her food and house and comfort, and he's her responsibility and all those sorts of things she loses. And remember, this is just a very basic sort of idea. And so the idea is that this can explain why hundreds of thousands of years later, we actually see this in emotional versus passionate infidelity, that men and women tend to view infidelity differently and get upset at different types of infidelity. And of course, we see that jealousy, is often bred by insecurity and sometimes is a matter of coping, especially if the relationship is not going well. So the final thing I want to talk about here is the end of relationships. And just make sure this is the last slide. So when we talk about the detachment process, and if you're in a relationship and you find that you don't want to be in that relationship anymore, what we find is that there tends to be both passive and active sort of things that we can do. So some of it leads to salvaging a relationship, and then other times we see that it doesn't. So if instead of somebody going, I want to break up with you, some alternatives can be, for example, loyalty. So you like, well, I don't want to break up with this person. We're detaching, but I want to stick it out and see if it's going to get better. So that would be an alternative to exiting or ending the relationship. Neglect is also another alternative because you just ignore the fact that the relationship's going sour and you just let it deteriorate. Instead of standing up and ending it and exiting it, you just say, well, I'm just going to ignore this till it gets to the point where the other person might have to take action. Another alternative to exiting is obviously voicing your concern and saying, hey, we need to do something about this. We need to improve our relationship. And obviously that has a really good consequence, because a lot of times just simply communication can improve a relationship and can turn things around. So looking at this, sort of constructive versus destructive, a passive way, a constructive yet passive way of looking at the detachment process is, loyalty, waiting for things to get better. Whereas an active, constructive way is to voice your concerns. A destructive yet passive way is neglecting or ignoring the partner. And an active, destructive way is simply ending the relationship. And that's a detachment process. That is, of course, that we see in relationships. Now, one thing I want to kind of end with, I think the last slide is, I thought I had a review slide here. Now, I must have taken that off. Sorry about that. Looking at relationships, what we have found in the literature and in the research is that, and this kind of, I want to talk about this because I don't want to end necessarily with this idea of detachment process. I want to end with this idea of what makes relationships work. And this is something that isn't in the slides, but something I do want to cover, and I always do cover this in this lecture. And that's where the research tells us. How is it that people spend a long time together? And how is it that, we look at these relationships where people are happy? And how is it that people can go 40 years together and not end things, especially when we see, such high rates of divorce these days? So we see, over 50% of relationships tend to end in divorce today. Well, after a lot of study, what we actually find is that people who tend to look at the positives in their partner whenever something bad happens, what we find is that they tend to, and these are the happier couples that tend to stick around longer, we find that when something happens, a person is much more likely, if something bad happens, to attribute that bad thing not to that person's attributes, but to external factors. And I'll give you an example. Let's say, and this is a happy couple that is in a long-term relationship. Let's say the husband comes home, and I'm just going to use a heterosexual relationship just because it's easier in this case. So a husband comes home and he's in a really terrible mood, and he throws his laptop down, and he's really upset, and he's really angry, and he just snaps at his wife, and he just is like just a real big jerk to her. If you're going to look at external factors, the wife may say, well, he must have had a really bad day at work. And that explains why he was being a jerk. And that explains why he was, mean and in a poor mood. It must be an external reason. A person who is in a relationship that tends to have a worse outcome would look at an internal factors. So same scenario, the husband comes home in a really bad mood, and the wife goes, wow, he is just a jerk. That's just who he is. He is never nice. He's in a bad mood. He's just in a bad mood because he's a jerk. And look at internal features and internal attributes. That's his personality. That's just who he is. He's just a jerk, right? So you see the difference there. Something bad happens, and in good relationships and healthy relationships, we find that partners tend to look at external factors to explain why that person misbehaved. Now, let's look at positive things. So let's say the man comes home. Again, let's just go with a heterosexual relationship just for ease. Man comes home and he brings his wife flowers. And so he leaves it on the table and he goes off and does his thing. In a healthy relationship, a wife would go, wow, that's so nice of him. He's such a caring person. And so what she'll do is she'll have internal attributes to explain something good that happens. And in an unhealthy relationship, what would happen is you would blame external factors. So you would say, okay, well, he just got me flowers because he must have done something wrong, or he's just trying to suck up to me, or he wants something in return. And so those are external factors. Instead of saying, wow, this person loves me so much and is such a nice person, those are internal attributes. They're a nice person. They're kind. They just want to make me happy. Versus external explanations for good behaviors. That is a pretty stark difference. And the literature shows that is pretty consistent among healthy versus unhealthy couples. So if you're in a relationship and you really want it to work, and it's a really healthy relationship, and you really, really like this person, the idea is that all of their good behavior explained by internal reasons, and all their bad behavior, try to explain that with external reasons. And you might find that you end up actually liking the person even more than you did when you started. So if anybody has any questions, you can email me. Hopefully you got a little bit more out of this lecture than just the slides. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, and have a great day.